Welcome to the program. I'm your host, Neil Howard, here on Health Professional Radio. Thank you so much for joining us again. In this segment, we're going to be speaking with Dr. Mark Berman. He's joining us here as Chief Medical Officer of Better Therapeutics. He's going to talk about how prescription digital therapeutics, or PDTs, could reimagine how we treat type 2 diabetes and how our current system of treatment doesn't work for more than half of patients. Welcome to Health Professional Radio, Dr. Mark Berman. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Thanks, Neil. It's a pleasure to be here.
Give us a brief insight to who Dr. Mark Berman is and talk briefly about your role at Better Therapeutics and Better Therapeutics' mission, if you would.
Sure, Neil. I'm Mark Berman. I'm the Chief Medical Officer for Better Therapeutics. I am trained as a primary care provider, trained in primary care and internal medicine and population medicine at the Brigham and Women's Hospital. And I've worked, both treating patients with cardiometabolic disease, and for the past 15 years have worked alongside innovators who are using software to facilitate health behavior change. At Better Therapeutics, we are pioneering a prescription digital therapeutics platform to treat type 2 diabetes and a host of other cardiometabolic conditions that result from unhealthy behaviors. And when I joined the company, it was widely evident that while the standard of care for these conditions emphasized the importance of behavior change, the reality is that providers and systems really have been unable to scale behavioral therapy to address the millions of patients that are diagnosed with cardiometabolic conditions each year. So this is a gap that we're trying to fill at Better Therapeutics. And our platform, beginning with BT001, delivers a new form of cognitive behavioral therapy to help patients change the behaviors like dietary pattern and physical activity that really directly impact cardiometabolic health.
Your new approach is basically behaviors that lead to type 2 diabetes as opposed to treating symptoms. We're all told, eat right, exercise more, drink water, don't smoke, don't do this, do that, or the other. What is it about now that has brought about this change within Better Therapeutics, addressing behaviors as opposed to symptoms?
Well, it's true. Everyone knows, it's widely appreciated, the importance of behavior change. And that's why, the standard of care guidelines for all cardiometabolic conditions really emphasize the need to change behaviors. But I think as individuals and as providers, we also appreciate how difficult that is. For the past, 30 or 40 years, there have been efforts to educate patients to change behaviors. And the reality is that while there have been successful proof of concepts, and successful studies that have used methods to help patients change behaviors, there has not been any effort that has had the ability to scale. So what's different about now is we have the ability to use software to package evidence-based forms of behavioral therapy that have longstanding evidence that they can help patients make and sustain clinically meaningful changes. And we can package that in software that is inherently scalable and convenient and accessible for patients. And so that's the exciting opportunity that we have with prescription digital therapeutics to bring this evidence-based scalable form of behavioral therapy to patients and fill that gap that is widely appreciated by providers and patients alike.
When practitioners and patients are set in their ways, for lack of a better term, obviously the system isn't working now, the current system that we have in place for treating type 2 diabetes, and it obviously wasn't working then from both a patient standpoint and a healthcare perspective. Are you anticipating maybe some pushback, people wanting to maintain the status quo as far as treatment?
I think there's generally high levels of dissatisfaction with the current status quo. We have millions of patients who are being diagnosed each year with type 2 diabetes. And I think both providers and patients are doing their best to treat a very serious condition. But the reality is that only 50% or so of patients are actually achieving glycemic control goals. And a very large number of patients are needing to use a large number of medications, what we would call polypharmacy. And about 50% of patients with type 2 diabetes are experiencing polypharmacy, and the side effects, the cost, the inconvenience, and the lifelong need to either swallow pills or take injections to treat a condition that, again, in only half of cases is actually reaching its clinical targets. So this is a challenging situation, I think, one that stems from the fact that we've been unable to address the root causes of the conditions. So while it's true that not every patient is going to be ready to make behavioral changes, I think many are hungry for a method that is accessible and convenient and evidence-based that will help them make those changes and hopefully help some patients avoid the need for further increases in medications or even in some cases be able to reduce their reliance on pharmacotherapy.
Now, I heard you mention BT001. Could you tell us about this prescription digital therapeutic and how it's going to benefit those with type 2 diabetes?
Sure. BT001 will be an FDA-regulated prescription digital therapeutic that's designed to treat type 2 diabetes using a novel form of cognitive behavioral therapy or CBT that targets the behaviors that lead to poor glycemic control. Now, CBT is the gold standard for evidence-based forms of behavioral therapy, and it's grounded in two central ideas. First is that every behavior is learned, and second, that behavioral dysfunction arises from errors in processing information, typically due to dysfunctional core beliefs. And CBT, as I've mentioned before, has been shown to achieve sustained clinically meaningful behavioral changes in type 2 diabetes and other cardiometabolic diseases. So BT001 is a mobile app that will ultimately be prescribed by a physician or a care provider to provide a 90-day personalized form of CBT that can be used alongside standard medical management for type 2 diabetes.
Well, if you would you briefly summarize your recent pivotal trial's positive primary endpoint readouts for BT001?
Sure. This is an open-label, randomized, controlled, multi-site study that's comparing standard of care treatment with or without BT001 in a nationally representative sample of 725 randomized patients with long-standing type 2 diabetes, high cardiovascular risk, multiple comorbidities, and poor glycemic control despite use of multiple medications. Now, a key strength of the trial was the diversity of the patients recruited. We had notable participation from women and minority groups that are often underrepresented in diabetes studies. 40% were non-white, 40% did not have a college degree, and a high proportion lived in low-income neighborhoods. The primary efficacy endpoint showed a highly statistically significant improvements in A1C between the intervention and the control groups, with an estimated treatment difference of 0.4% and a highly statistically significant p-value. We saw clinically meaningful changes, which are defined as an A1C reduction of 0.4% or more, which occurred in about 45% of the BT001 group versus 27% in the group receiving standard of care alone. Also highly statistically significant difference. And those responders reduced A1C by a mean of 1.1%. So we believe this demonstrates that the use of BT001 significantly improved A1C compared with the standard of care alone. And finally, this trial also evaluated the safety of BT001. There were no safety events that were attributed to the use of BT001, and if anything, there was a trend to fewer serious adverse events in the BT001 group. So in summary, we saw at 90 days a clear signal of efficacy and a very good safety profile.
Now, what's the timeline for the wrap up and submission to FDA for clearance?
Well, the study is ongoing, but should be completed at the end of this quarter. And given the very positive benefit to risk profile that we're seeing in BT001 thus far, we expect to file a de novo classification request with the FDA immediately upon completion of the study.
Now, explain briefly what the de novo approval is.
The de novo approval is a regulatory pathway that the FDA has for novel devices or therapeutics. So we'll be going through that pathway to ask for marketing authorization for BT001 based on our pivotal results.
And what type of feedback have you been hearing from not just the research teams, but physicians who will potentially be prescribing?
By and large, physicians have shared very positive feedback on the clinical data to date. They recognize the gap in care that BT001 aims to fill. And I think they understand clearly the challenges that are facing their patients with type 2 diabetes. So they're expressing optimism that, an evidence-based non-pharmacological intervention might be available for them to prescribe. to enable better care of their patients, without the increasing burden of side effects and lifelong medication use that is associated with current therapies.
Well, give us a website where we can learn much more about Better Therapeutics.
You can learn more about us at bettertx.com.
Mark, it's been a pleasure speaking with you. Thank you again for taking the time with us this morning.
Neil, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
You've been listening to Health Professional Radio. I'm your host, Neil Howard, in conversation with Dr. Mark Berman, Chief Medical Officer of Better Therapeutics. Audio copies of this program are available at hpr.fm and healthprofessionalradio.com.au. You can also subscribe to the podcast on iTunes. Listen in, download at SoundCloud, and be sure and subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/healthprofessionalradio.